The spring sun beat down mercilessly on Catherine Vance's pale skin as she stood trembling on the wooden auction platform. Her wrists, raw and bound with coarse rope, matched the red-rimmed eyes that darted frantically across the crowd of leering men gathered before her. Grass Valley, California, had once been just another gold mining town she'd heard about in passing now. It was the place where her freedom would be sold to the highest bidder. The year was 1876, and Catherine's world had collapsed into this single, terrifying moment. "Next up, gentlemen, we have ourselves a fine specimen," the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the dusty town square. This pretty little thing was caught trying to escape her contract with the Blackwater Mining Company. Her debt's now up for sale to whoever's willing to take on this spirited filly. Catherine flinched as the man's meaty hand gripped her shoulder, spinning her around for the crowd to inspect. Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks as catcalls and whistles rose from the assembly. At 22, she had never imagined this would be her fate when she'd left Boston in search of her missing brother 6 months earlier. "We'll start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer shouted. "Who'll give me 50 for this delicate flower?" "50, came a call from the crowd. "60, shouted another. Catherine's knees threatened to buckle beneath her as the bids climbed. She'd been working as a laundress at the mining camp to pay off her brother's debts, hoping to find some trace of him. Instead, she'd discovered the company's ledgers falsified, the debts inflated beyond reason. Her attempt to flee had led her here. "125, called a gravelly voice that made her blood run cold. She recognized the voice. It belonged to Jonas Wilkes, the saloon owner whose wandering hands she'd slapped away more than once during her time in town. "125 going once." The auctioneer began. $500. The crowd fell silent, parting to reveal a tall figure at the back. Catherine squinted against the sun, trying to make out the man's features as he stepped forward. Broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His dark hat shaded most of his face, but she caught the glint of intense eyes beneath the brim. "Well now," the auctioneer stammered, clearly surprised by the extravagant bid. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Holloway." The stranger stepped closer, and Catherine could now see him clearly. Dust coated his worn leather chaps and the deep blue of his shirt, suggesting he'd ridden hard to get here. A weathered gun belt hung low on his hips, though his hands remained casually at his sides. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing a mouth set in a firm line, and those eyes sharp and piercing were fixed directly on hers. "Look at me, not them," he said quietly, his voice carrying to her despite the murmurs of the crowd. There was something in his tone, not a command, but almost a reassurance that made Catherine raise her chin and meet his gaze. "500 going once, going twice," the auctioneer called, scanning the crowd for any competing bids. Jonas Wilkes spat on the ground, his expression thunderous, but he remained silent. "Sold to Mr. Ross Holloway for $500. The man Ross Holloway approached the platform, counting out bills from a leather pouch. As the auctioneer handed over the contract papers, Catherine felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. She had been purchased like cattle, her fate now tied to this stranger with the steady gaze. Ross Holloway took her by the elbow, his touch unexpectedly gentle as he helped her down from the platform. "Keep walking," he murmured, guiding her through the disappointed crowd. "And keep looking at me if you need to. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing your fear." Catherine struggled to keep pace with his long strides as they moved away from the auction square. What do you intend to do with me?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, continuing to lead her down the main street toward a hitching post where a magnificent chestnut stallion waited. Only when they reached the horse did he turn to face her fully, pulling a knife from his belt. Catherine recoiled instinctively, but Ross simply reached for her bound wrists. With a single, careful motion, he sliced through the ropes, freeing her hands. "First thing I intend to do is get these off you," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "The second is to get you somewhere safe. After that, it's up to you." Catherine rubbed her chafed wrists, confusion washing over her. "I don't understand." Ross glanced back toward the auction square, his expression hardening. "I've been tracking Blackwater Mining's operations for months. They've been running this same scheme across 3 counties, hiring workers, falsifying debts, then selling contracts when people can't pay." He looked back at her, his eyes softening slightly. "You're not the first person they've done this to, but I aim to make sure you're one of the last." You bought me to help me?" Catherine asked, hardly daring to hope. "I bought your contract," he corrected, holding up the papers before tucking them into his vest. "But I don't own you, miss." "Vance," she supplied. "Catherine Vance, Miss Vance," he nodded. "I'm Ross Holloway, U.S. Marshal. Been working undercover to build a case against Blackwater and their associates." He gestured toward his horse. "Now, we need to move. Those men back there aren't going to be happy when they realize what's happening, especially not Wilkes. He's in deep with Blackwater." Catherine glanced nervously over her shoulder, suddenly aware of several men from the auction watching them from down the street. "Where will we go?" "I've got a cabin about 10 miles outside town," Ross said, untying his horse. "We'll be safe there while I figure out next steps." He held out his hand. "Can you ride?" Catherine nodded, taking his offered hand and allowing him to help her mount. She settled behind the saddle, unsure where to place her hands until Ross swung up in front of her. "Hold on," he instructed, and she hesitantly placed her hands at his waist. As the horse began to move, Catherine instinctively tightened her grip, pressing closer to the solid warmth of his back. They'd barely cleared the edge of town when Catherine heard shouting behind them. She looked back to see Jonas Wilkes and 3 other men mounting horses. "They're coming after us," she warned, her voice tight with fear. Ross glanced back, his expression grim. "Sooner than I expected. Hold tight, Miss Vance. This is about to get uncomfortable." He dug his heels into the stallion's flanks, and the horse leapt forward with surprising speed. Catherine clung desperately to Ross's waist as they thundered along the trail, the wind whipping tears from her eyes. The dense pine forests of the Sierra foothills flashed by in a green blur, the horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. For nearly an hour they rode hard, the sounds of pursuit fading and then returning as their pursuers gained ground on the winding mountain trails. Catherine's entire body ached, her hands cramped from clutching Ross's shirt, but she refused to complain. Freedom, even this uncertain, dangerous freedom, was worth the discomfort. "There," Ross called over his shoulder, gesturing toward a narrow gap between 2 rocky outcroppings. "Hold on." He guided the horse off the main trail and through the passage, which opened into a small canyon. A stream tumbled down one side, feeding into a clear pool before continuing its journey downhill. Nestled against the far wall stood a modest cabin, its weathered logs blending with the surrounding landscape. Ross reined in the horse near the cabin door, quickly dismounting before reaching up to help Catherine down. Her legs nearly buckled as they touched ground, but Ross caught her elbow, steadying her. "Inside, quickly," he urged, leading her toward the cabin while keeping a wary eye on the passage they'd come through. "They might have followed our trail." The cabin's interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center, and a narrow bed stood in one corner. Shelves lined another wall, stocked with provisions and books. It wasn't grand, but to Catherine's exhausted eyes, it looked like sanctuary. Ross moved with practiced efficiency, securing the door and checking the shuttered windows. He retrieved a rifle from above the fireplace, checking that it was loaded before propping it within easy reach. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning his attention to Catherine, who stood uncertainly in the middle of the room. She shook her head. "Just sore from the ride." She hesitated, then asked, "Those men, will they find us here?" "Not likely," Ross answered, moving to a cupboard and retrieving a canteen. "Few people know about this place. It belonged to an old prospector who died last winter. I've been using it as a base while I investigate Blackwater." He handed her the canteen. "Drink. You look ready to collapse." Catherine accepted gratefully, taking a long swallow of cool water. As her immediate thirst eased, other needs made themselves known: hunger, exhaustion, and a desperate desire to be clean. Reading her expression, Ross gestured toward the back of the cabin. "There's a wash basin through there. Water from the stream runs through a pipe into a tank. It'll be cold but clean." He paused, then added awkwardly, "I don't have women's clothing, but there's a spare shirt and trousers that might fit you well enough." Catherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway. That's most considerate." He nodded stiffly. "I'll see to the horse and keep watch. Take your time." As he stepped outside, Catherine found herself suddenly alone in the strange cabin. Part of her wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake trusting this man, this stranger who had purchased her contract. But something in his direct gaze, in the careful way he'd cut her bonds, told her Ross Holloway was not like the others. She found the washroom little more than a screened-off corner with a metal basin and a crude drain leading outside. True to Ross's word, a pipe brought clear mountain water into a tank above the basin. Catherine stripped off her filthy dress and petticoats, using a scrap of cloth to wash away the dust and fear of the day. The cold water stung her skin, but she welcomed the discomfort, scrubbing until her pale skin turned pink. The clothing Ross had mentioned hung from a peg on the wall: a faded blue shirt and canvas trousers that had clearly been patched more than once. The garments swam on her slender frame, but after cinching the trousers with a length of rope and rolling up the sleeves, she felt remarkably more comfortable than she had in her restrictive dress. When she emerged from the washroom, Ross was stoking a small fire in the fireplace. He glanced up, and for a moment, something that might have been appreciation flashed in his eyes before he looked away. "Feel better?" he asked, turning his attention back to the fire. "Much," Catherine replied, running a hand through her damp auburn hair. "Thank you." Ross nodded toward a pot hanging over the fire. "Stew should be ready soon. It's nothing fancy, just dried beef and whatever vegetables were still good." "It smells wonderful," Catherine said sincerely, her stomach growling at the aroma. She hesitated, then asked, "Mr. Holloway, why did you help me? $500 is a considerable sum." Ross was quiet for a long moment, continuing to tend the fire. When he finally looked up, his expression was guarded. "Like I said, I've been tracking Blackwater's operations. But—" he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "The truth is, I saw you standing there and I couldn't just watch. Some things a man can't abide, and treating people like property is one of them." Catherine studied him, noting the way the firelight caught the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "You're a rare sort of man, then. Most would have looked the other way." "Most haven't seen what I have," he replied cryptically, standing to retrieve 2 tin plates from a shelf. "War has a way of making a man's priorities clear." "You fought in the war between the states?" Catherine asked. Ross nodded, dishing stew into the plates. "Union cavalry. Saw things no man should see, did things I hope to someday make peace with." He handed her a plate and a spoon. "But that's a story for another time. Eat while it's hot." They ate in companionable silence, the stew simple but filling. Catherine couldn't remember the last time food had tasted so good, perhaps because it was the first meal she'd eaten as a free woman in months. As they finished, Ross cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about your situation, Miss Vance. You mentioned you were looking for your brother." Catherine nodded, setting down her empty plate. "James came west nearly a year ago. He wrote regularly at first, then his letters stopped. The last one mentioned he'd found work with the Blackwater Mining Company." Her voice tightened. "When I couldn't get answers by mail, I decided to come find him myself. I arrived in Grass Valley with enough money for a month's lodging, but it disappeared quickly. When I asked at the mining office about James, they claimed he'd left owing a substantial debt. They offered to help by hiring me to work it off. And then they kept adding to what you owed," Ross finished grimly. "It's their pattern. Did you ever find any trace of your brother?" Catherine shook her head, blinking back tears. "Only rumors. One man said James had headed north to the Idaho territories. Another claimed he'd gone to San Francisco, but no one seemed to know for certain." Ross was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've seen Blackwater's records, the real ones, not the falsified books they show their workers. If your brother was employed by them, his name should be there. First thing tomorrow I'll check my notes." Hope fluttered in Catherine's chest, but she tempered it with caution. "Even if you find where he went, he could be anywhere by now." "True," Ross acknowledged, "but it's a start." He stood, gathering their plates. "You should rest. Take the bed, I'll keep watch for a while, then sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Catherine protested. "You can and you will," Ross said firmly, though his eyes held a glint of humor. "My mother raised me better than to let a lady sleep on the floor, Miss Vance." Despite her exhaustion, Catherine found herself smiling. "Catherine," she said, "if we're to be hiding out together, you might as well use my given name." Something in Ross's expression softened. "Catherine," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "Get some rest, Catherine. Tomorrow we start figuring out what to do next." As she settled onto the narrow bed, pulling a rough wool blanket over herself, Catherine watched Ross through half-closed eyes. He moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking windows and doors before settling into a chair with a clear view of both the entrance and the bed. With his rifle across his knees and his profile illuminated by the dying fire, he looked like a figure from one of the dime novels her brother used to read, the noble gunslinger, protector of the innocent. Except this wasn't fiction. This was her life now, inexplicably entwined with that of a mysterious U.S. Marshal in a remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada foothills. As sleep claimed her, Catherine wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether Ross Holloway would really be able to help her find her brother, or if this brief taste of freedom was all she'd be allowed. Dawn broke gently over the cabin, golden light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Catherine stirred, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in muscles unused to long hours on horseback. Ross was already awake, standing at the small iron stove with his back to her. The scent of coffee filled the cabin, rich and inviting. He must have heard her movement, for he spoke without turning. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash up. Coffee's almost ready." Catherine swung her legs over the side of the bed, hastily smoothing her borrowed clothes and running fingers through her tangled hair. "Thank you. You didn't need to let me sleep so late." At that, Ross did turn, an amused expression crossing his features. "Late? It's barely past sunrise. Most folks would consider this ungodly early." "Oh," Catherine felt her cheeks warm. At the mining camp, we started work before dawn. I suppose I lost track of normal hours. Something hardened in Ross's eyes. There wasn't much normal about that place. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Catherine. I checked the perimeter earlier. No sign anyone followed us yesterday, but we should still be careful. Catherine accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the steam before taking a cautious sip. The coffee was strong and black, not the weak tea she was accustomed to, but the bitter warmth was welcome. "What happens now?" she asked. Ross leaned against the table, cradling his own cup. "I need to get word to my superior in Sacramento about what's happening in Grass Valley. Blackwater's operation is bigger than I initially thought. They've got connections in the county government, maybe higher." He took a drink of coffee before continuing. "But first, I promise to help you look for information about your brother." He moved to a saddlebag hanging near the door, retrieving a leather-bound journal and several folded papers. "These are copies of records I managed to acquire from the Blackwater office. Employee logs, payment records, that sort of thing." Catherine set down her cup and joined him at the table as he spread the papers out. "How did you get these?" The corner of Ross's mouth twitched. "Let's just say I'm handy with locks and light on my feet." He shuffled through the papers. "What was your brother's full name and when did he start working for them?" "James Edward Vance," Catherine replied. "His letters indicated he began working for Blackwater last summer, June or July of '75. Ross nodded, scanning the documents methodically. Several minutes passed in silence as he searched, occasionally pausing to compare one paper with another. Finally, he tapped a line on one of the sheets. "Here. James Vance, hired July 3, 1875 as a blaster for the North Star mine." His brow furrowed as he traced the entry to the right. "According to this, he worked until October 18 then." He hesitated. "What?" Catherine leaned closer, her heart pounding. "What does it say?" Ross looked up, his expression grave. "It says he was injured in a shaft collapse. Medical expenses were added to his account then." He traced the line to another column. "His contract was sold on November 2 to a P. Montgomery of Virginia City, Nevada Territory." Catherine's breath caught. "Sold, like mine was," Ross nodded grimly. "Exactly like yours. It's all part of their operation. They create these debts, then sell the contracts to associates in other territories' mining operations, ranches, businesses that need cheap labor." "So my brother could be in Nevada?" Catherine asked, hope and dread warring within her. "It's possible," Ross said cautiously. "But Virginia City is nearly 200 miles from here, across the Sierra Nevada range, and this was 8 months ago. He might not still be there." Catherine straightened her shoulders, determination replacing fear. "But it's the only lead we have. At least we know he was alive in November." Ross studied her for a moment, something like admiration in his gaze. "You're a resilient woman, Catherine Vance." "I've had to be," she replied simply. "Our parents died when James was 17 and I was 15. We had only each other. When he came west seeking his fortune, I stayed in Boston with our aunt, but when his letters stopped—" She shook her head. "I couldn't just sit and wonder. I had to find him." Ross nodded slowly, refolding the papers. "Virginia City it is then, but we can't just ride in there. Blackwater has connections throughout the mining regions, and after yesterday they'll be watching for both of us." "What do you suggest?" Ross ran a hand through his hair, thinking. "First, I need to get a message to my superior. There's a trusted telegraph operator in Nevada City, about 20 miles from here. We can head there, send the wire, then make plans to reach Virginia City." He paused. "But we'll need supplies and you'll need proper clothing. We can't have you traveling in men's clothes. It would draw too much attention." Catherine glanced down at the oversized shirt and trousers she wore. "I suppose you're right, but I have no money and my few possessions were left at the boarding house in Grass Valley." Ross waved away her concern. "I've been saving my marshal's pay for months. We'll get what you need in Nevada City." He hesitated, then added, "But we should wait until nightfall to travel. It's safer." They spent the day preparing for their journey. Ross taught Catherine how to clean and load his spare revolver, insisting she keep it with her. "The mountains aren't always friendly," he explained, "and neither are some of the men in them." As Catherine practiced drawing and aiming the weapon, she caught Ross watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "What is it?" she asked. "Am I doing it wrong?" He shook his head. "Not at all. You're a natural." He paused. "I was just thinking that most women I've known would be in hysterics after what you've been through. Yet here you are, learning to shoot and planning a journey across the mountains to find your brother." Catherine lowered the gun, considering his words. "I've cried my share of tears, Mr. Holloway." "Ross," he interrupted. "If I'm to call you Catherine, you should call me Ross." She nodded. "Ross, then. As I was saying, I've shed tears over my situation, but they didn't help. Action is what's needed now." Something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Well said." He cleared his throat and turned away, busying himself with packing provisions into saddlebags. "We should be ready to ride by sunset." As the day wore on, Catherine found herself studying Ross when he wasn't looking. There was something compelling about the lean, capable marshal. It wasn't just his handsome features, though those were certainly noteworthy. It was the quiet competence with which he moved, the thoughtful consideration in his eyes when he spoke to her, the way he treated her not as a helpless female but as a partner in their developing plan. When darkness finally fell, they doused the fire and prepared to leave the cabin. Ross had Catherine wear his spare coat over her borrowed clothes, both for warmth in the mountain night and to partially disguise her feminine figure should they encounter anyone on the trail. "It's about 4 hours' ride to Nevada City," Ross explained as he helped Catherine mount. "We'll stick to the back trails. With luck, we'll arrive well before dawn and find rooms at an inn where the proprietor doesn't ask too many questions." As they rode through the moonlit forest, Catherine found herself holding tightly to Ross's waist again, though this time more from choice than necessity. There was something reassuring about his solid presence before her, something that made her feel safer than she had in months. They traveled in relative silence, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves and the occasional call of a night bird. About halfway through their journey, they paused by a stream to rest the horse and stretch their legs. "How are you holding up?" Ross asked as he helped Catherine dismount. "Better than yesterday," she replied, wincing slightly as she straightened her stiff limbs. "Though I suspect I'll never walk normally again." Ross chuckled, the sound warm in the cool night air. "You get used to it. After a while you feel strange when you're not in the saddle." Catherine smiled, then sobered. "Ross, I've been thinking about what happens after we reach Nevada City." "Oh." He busied himself checking the horse's saddle girth, not meeting her eyes. "You have your duties as a marshal. You need to report on Blackwater's activities and continue your investigation. I can't ask you to abandon that to help me search for James." Ross straightened, facing her directly. "Are you suggesting we part ways in Nevada City?" Catherine nodded reluctantly. "It seems the sensible course. You've already done more for me than I could ever repay. I can find work in Nevada City, save money for passage to Virginia City." "And if Blackwater's men find you?" Ross asked, his voice sharp. "What then?" "I'll be careful," Catherine insisted. "With proper women's clothing and perhaps a different hairstyle, they might not recognize me." Ross shook his head firmly. It's too dangerous. Blackwater has eyes everywhere in these mining towns. He hesitated, then continued in a softer tone. Besides, I gave you my word I'd help you find your brother. I don't break my promises, Catherine. There was something in his voice, a hint of emotion beneath the usual calm control that made Catherine's heart beat faster. But my duty is to uphold the law and protect citizens, Ross interrupted. You're a citizen being hunted by criminals. Helping you is entirely within my jurisdiction. A slight smile curved his lips. And if that help happens to take us to Virginia City, where Blackwater also has operations I can investigate, well, that's just efficient use of government resources. Catherine couldn't help but laugh at his reasoning. You've thought this through, haven't you? I have, Ross admitted, his expression turning serious again. The truth is, Catherine, I'm not willing to just send you off alone. Not only would it be dangerous for you, but— He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. I've grown accustomed to your company. I'd miss it. The simple admission hung in the air between them, more meaningful for its hesitancy. Catherine felt a curious warmth spread through her chest despite the cool night air. I'd miss yours as well, she replied softly. For a moment, they stood looking at each other in the dappled moonlight filtering through the trees. Ross took a half step toward her, then seemed to think better of it, clearing his throat and turning back to the horse. We should continue, he said, his voice gruffer than before. Still have a ways to go. As they resumed their journey, Catherine found herself acutely aware of every point where her body pressed against Ross's, her hands at his waist, her thighs against his, her cheek occasionally resting against his broad back when the trail grew steeper. She tried to tell herself that her racing pulse was merely from the exertion of travel, but a deeper honesty forced her to admit that it had more to do with the man before her than the journey itself. Nevada City appeared before them just as the eastern sky began to lighten. Its buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered hills. Unlike the rougher mining camps Catherine had seen, Nevada City had an established, almost elegant air, with proper buildings lining its main street instead of hastily constructed shanties. Ross guided them to a modest inn on a side street, dismounting and helping Catherine down before approaching the door. A bleary-eyed woman in her 50s answered his knock, looking annoyed until Ross pressed several coins into her hand. My wife and I need a room, he explained smoothly. We've been traveling all night to reach my ailing mother in Sacramento. Catherine felt her cheeks warm at the casual lie and at being referred to as Ross's wife, but she kept her expression neutral, playing along with the deception. The woman pocketed the money with a nod. Got one room left at the back, quiet with its own entrance. She eyed Catherine's male attire with raised eyebrows but asked no questions, simply leading them through the inn to a small but clean room containing a double bed, a washstand, and little else. Breakfast's at 7 if you want it, the woman said, handing Ross a key before departing. Once alone, an awkward silence fell between them. The only bed, loomed large in the small space. Ross cleared his throat. You take the bed, he said, setting down their bags. I'll sleep on the floor, Catherine bit her lip, suddenly shy. Are you sure? After riding all night, you must be as tired as I am. I've slept in worse places, Ross assured her, already spreading his bedroll on the floorboards. Get some rest. Later today, we'll need to get supplies and send that telegram. As exhausted as she was, Catherine found sleep elusive. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to Ross's steady breathing from his position on the floor, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been a virtual prisoner at the mining camp. Now she was in Nevada City with a U.S. Marshal who had literally purchased her freedom, planning a journey to find her brother. And if she were truly honest with herself, she would admit that her thoughts of James were increasingly shared with thoughts of Ross Holloway, his quiet strength, his unexpected kindness, the way his eyes seemed to see beyond her exterior to something within that even she didn't fully recognize. Catherine finally drifted off as sunlight began to filter through the curtained window, her last conscious thought a wondering of what it might be like to be truly married to a man like Ross, rather than merely pretending. When she awoke, several hours later, the room was empty. Momentary panic gripped her until she noticed a folded note on the washstand, alongside a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. The note, written in a surprisingly neat hand, read, "Gone to send telegram and arrange supplies. This should help with appearances until we can get proper clothing. Back by noon. Lock the door. R." Catherine unwrapped the bundle to find a simple calico dress, slightly worn but clean and approximately her size. Touched by his thoughtfulness, she quickly washed and changed, relishing the feeling of being properly dressed again, even if the garment was plain. True to his word, Ross returned just before midday, carrying several packages. He paused in the doorway when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. "The dress fits," he said, his voice oddly rough. "Good. It's perfect," Catherine replied. "Thank you. It feels wonderful to be dressed properly again." Ross set down his packages, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. It was practical, that's all, less conspicuous this way. He gestured to the packages. "I've got more things here, another dress, some personal items I thought you might need. The shopkeeper's wife helped me choose." Catherine was touched by his consideration. "That was very thoughtful." Ross shrugged, turning to unpack the supplies. "Were you able to send your telegram?" Catherine asked. He nodded. "Got word back too. My superior is sending agents to Grass Valley to investigate Blackwater. He's also authorized me to continue to Virginia City to look into their operations there." A smile tugged at his lips. "Seems our objectives align perfectly. When do we leave?" Catherine asked, her heart quickening at the prospect of continuing their journey together. "Tomorrow morning," Ross replied. "We'll take the stagecoach rather than horseback. It's faster and less suspicious than two people traveling alone. I've booked passage as Mr. and Mrs. Holloway." He glanced at her. "I hope you don't mind continuing the pretense. It's safer that way." "Of course," Catherine agreed, ignoring the flutter in her stomach at the idea of continuing to pose as Ross's wife. "How long is the journey?" 3 days if the weather holds," Ross said, laying out a map on the small table. "We'll cross the Sierra Nevada at Donner Pass, then down into the Great Basin. Virginia City sits on the eastern slope of Mount Davidson in the Virginia Range." Catherine studied the map, tracing the route with her finger. "It seems so far." "It is," Ross admitted, "and not an easy journey. The pass can be treacherous even in summer." He hesitated, then added, "Catherine, I want you to be prepared. Even if we reach Virginia City safely, we may not find your brother. It's been 8 months since his contract was sold. He could have moved on, or he could be dead," Catherine finished quietly. "I know, but I have to try. He's the only family I have left." Ross covered her hand with his, the touch gentle but firm. "Whatever we find, you're not alone anymore. I want you to know that." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that had been building since that moment on the auction platform when he'd told her to look at him, not the leering crowd. Catherine felt her breath catch, wondering if he might lean closer, if this might be the moment when a sharp knock at the door made them both start. Ross immediately tensed, reaching for his revolver before calling out, "Who is it?" "Message for Mr. Holloway," came a young voice. "From the telegraph office." Ross motioned for Catherine to move aside, positioning himself between her and the door before opening it cautiously. A freckle-faced boy of about 12 stood in the hallway, holding an envelope. "Telegraph operator said it was urgent, sir," the boy explained, handing over the envelope. Ross gave the boy a coin, then quickly closed and locked the door before tearing open the message. As he read, his expression darkened. "What is it?" Catherine asked, alarm rising within her. "Blackwater's men attacked the agents sent to Grass Valley," Ross said grimly. "One's dead, 2 injured, and they're looking for us." He crumpled the telegram in his fist. "We need to leave, now. Tonight's stage, not tomorrow's." "But you said plans change," Ross interrupted, already gathering their few possessions. "Get your things together. We have less than an hour." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. Catherine quickly packed the new clothing and items Ross had purchased, her mind racing. "Do you think they know we're in Nevada City?" "I don't know," Ross admitted, checking his revolver before holstering it. "But I'm not willing to risk it. The sooner we're out of here, the better." They left the inn through the back entrance, Ross scanning the street carefully before leading Catherine toward the stage-coach office. The town seemed peaceful enough, with no sign of pursuit, but Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching from every window, every alleyway. At the stage-coach office, Ross quietly explained the situation to the manager, who nodded gravely. "Coach leaves in 20 minutes. Got room for 2 more if you don't mind a tight fit." "We'll take it," Ross said, purchasing the tickets. The waiting area was crowded with travelers, a middle-aged couple dressed in Eastern finery, a portly businessman with a large trunk, and a young woman traveling alone. Catherine sat stiffly beside Ross, her nerves stretched taut as they waited for the stage to arrive. "Relax," Ross murmured, his hand covering hers briefly. "Acting nervous only draws attention." Catherine took a deep breath, forcing her shoulders to loosen. "You're right, I'm sorry." "Don't be," he replied, his voice low. "You're doing fine." When the stage-coach finally arrived, there was the usual chaos of loading luggage and passengers. Ross helped Catherine board, then took the seat beside her, positioning himself next to the window where he could watch the street. The coach was indeed crowded, with the 6 passengers pressed shoulder to shoulder on the leather benches. As the driver called to the horses and the coach lurched forward, Catherine felt Ross's tension ease slightly. They were moving, putting distance between themselves and any potential pursuers. But the road ahead was long and uncertain, leading to a town where they had no allies, and where Catherine's brother might or might not be found. The stagecoach rattled along the mountain roads, climbing steadily toward Donner Pass. Outside the windows, pine forests gave way to more rugged terrain, with granite outcroppings and steep drops that made Catherine's stomach clench when she looked down. The other passengers chatted sporadically. The Eastern couple were headed to San Francisco, the businessman to Carson City, and the young woman, a schoolteacher named Miss Porter, to a position in Virginia City. "Virginia City?" Catherine asked, interest piqued. "We're bound there as well." "Have you been before?" "No," Miss Porter replied, adjusting her spectacles. "But I've heard it's quite civilized for a mining town. They have an opera house, I'm told, and several churches." "It's all that and more," the businessman interjected. "Silver made Virginia City rich beyond imagining. The Comstock lode has produced over $300 million in ore. They say the sidewalks are paved with silver." "That's an exaggeration," Ross commented dryly. "But it is a wealthy town, with all the virtues and vices that wealth brings." The conversation continued amiably as the coach climbed higher, but Catherine noticed Ross remained vigilant, his gaze frequently scanning the passing landscape. When they stopped at a way station to change horses and allow the passengers a brief respite, He stayed close to Catherine, his hand often at the small of her back, a gesture both protective and possessive that she found she didn't mind at all. As they prepared to reboard the coach, Ross suddenly stiffened, his eyes fixed on a group of horsemen approaching from the direction they had come. "Get in the coach," he said quietly to Catherine. "Now." "What is it?" she asked, recognizing the alertness in his posture. "4 riders moving fast," Ross replied. "Could be nothing, but I don't like coincidences." Catherine climbed into the coach, heart pounding as Ross spoke briefly to the driver, who nodded and began hurrying the other passengers to board. Within minutes they were moving again, the driver pushing the fresh horses to a faster pace than before. "What did you tell him?" Catherine asked as Ross settled beside her. "That there might be trouble following us," he murmured, keeping his voice low enough that the other passengers couldn't hear. "Offered him extra to make better time." The coach raced along the mountain roads, taking curves at alarming speeds. The Eastern lady gasped and clutched her husband's arm at particularly sharp turns, while the businessman mopped his brow nervously. Only Miss Porter seemed unperturbed, reading a small volume of poetry as if the wild ride were nothing unusual. Catherine found her hand seeking Ross's, drawing comfort from his steady grip. As the afternoon wore on and the coach continued its breakneck pace without sign of pursuit, she began to hope they had outrun whatever danger Ross had sensed. That hope was shattered as they rounded a bend in a narrow section of road. Ahead, blocking their path, were 3 mounted men, rifles raised. "Road agents," the driver shouted, hauling on the reins to slow the horses. Ross cursed under his breath, releasing Catherine's hand to reach for his revolver. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice hard. Before the coach had fully stopped, one of the mounted men called out, "We want Holloway and the woman. Hand them over and the rest of you can continue unharmed." "Not road agents," Ross muttered grimly. "Blackwater men." The passengers erupted in confused alarm, the businessman demanding to know what was happening while the Eastern lady began to weep softly. Miss Porter closed her book with deliberate calm, fixing Ross with a questioning gaze. "I'm a U.S. Marshal," Ross explained quietly to the coach's occupants. "These men are criminals I've been pursuing. They have no authority to stop this coach or demand anything." "What do we do?" the Eastern gentleman asked, his face pale but determined. Ross's expression was grim. "I can't ask you to risk yourselves in my fight." "Seems to me they've already involved us," Miss Porter observed coolly. "And I, for one, don't take kindly to being threatened on public roads." The businessman nodded reluctantly. "Damned outrage stopping a U.S. mail coach." "That's a federal offense." Outside, the leader of the mounted men was growing impatient. "Last chance, Holloway, we know you're in there." Ross looked at Catherine, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding without words. They couldn't endanger the other passengers, but neither could they surrender to Blackwater's men. "I'm coming out," Ross called, moving toward the coach door. "Let these people go." "Ross, no," Catherine whispered fiercely, grabbing his arm. He squeezed her hand briefly. "Trust me," he murmured before addressing the other passengers. "When I step out, be ready to duck down. Things might get messy." Ross opened the coach door and stepped out, hands raised. Catherine peered through the window, her heart in her throat as she watched him face the 3 armed men. "Where's the woman?" demanded the leader, a grizzled man with a scar running along his jaw. "Safe," Ross replied calmly, "and she'll stay that way." The scarred man sneered. "That's not for you to decide, Marshal. She's Blackwater property, fair and legal." "There's nothing legal about what Blackwater's been doing," Ross countered, his stance relaxed but ready. "And people can't be property. Not anymore." As the men faced off, Catherine noticed movement in the rocks above the road, a flash of metal, a shadow shifting. Another ambush point. Her breath caught as she realized there were more men waiting to trap them. Without thinking, Catherine grabbed Ross's spare revolver from his bag and thrust open the coach door. "Ross, above you!" Ross dropped and rolled as shots rang out from the rocks, drawing his own weapon as he moved. The three mounted men, momentarily distracted by the gunfire from their allies, were slow to react. Ross fired twice in rapid succession, hitting one rider in the shoulder and causing another's horse to rear in panic, throwing its rider. Catherine scrambled from the coach as more shots peppered the ground around them. To her surprise, Miss Porter emerged behind her, a small derringer in her hand. "Get behind the coach," Ross shouted, returning fire toward the rocks. The driver, showing unexpected courage, had unboxed his own shotgun and was providing covering fire, allowing the passengers to seek shelter on the far side of the vehicle. The Eastern gentleman had produced a pocket pistol and was standing protectively near his wife, while the businessman cowered behind a large boulder. "Are you hit?" Ross asked Catherine as she crouched beside him. She shook her head. "I saw them in the rocks. There are at least 2 more up there." Ross nodded grimly. "Good eyes." He glanced at Miss Porter, eyebrow raised at her weapon. "A woman traveling alone needs protection," she explained simply. A bullet splintered the wood of the coach inches from Catherine's head. Ross pulled her closer, shielding her with his body as he returned fire. "We're pinned down," he muttered. "Can't stay here." The scarred leader, having regained control of his spooked horse, called out again. "This is your last chance, Holloway. Give us the woman and walk away." "Why do they want me so badly?" Catherine whispered. "I'm nothing to them." "You're a witness to their operation," Ross replied. "And if they make an example of you, it keeps other workers from trying to escape." He checked his ammunition, frowning. "I'm running low." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with occasional gunfire exchanged but no clear advantage gained by either side. Catherine's hands were steady on the revolver, but her mind raced with the desperate knowledge that they couldn't remain trapped on the mountain road indefinitely. A piercing whistle suddenly cut through the tension, followed by the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the direction they'd been traveling. Ross tensed, clearly expecting reinforcements for their attackers. Instead, around the bend came a stagecoach escorted by 4 armed riders in uniform, a scheduled patrol of the mountain routes, arriving at the most fortuitous moment imaginable. The Blackwater men, seeing themselves suddenly outnumbered, retreated hastily, disappearing into the rocky landscape as the patrol approached. "Wells Fargo security," Ross explained to Catherine as the uniformed men surrounded the stranded coach. "Regular patrols along this route because of the gold and silver shipments." The next hours passed in a blur of explanations and arrangements. Ross's marshal's badge earned immediate respect from the patrol, who provided escort for the continuation of their journey. The wounded Blackwater man was taken into custody, secured in the patrol wagon for transport to the nearest jail. By nightfall, they had reached a larger way station near the summit of Donner Pass, where the passengers were provided rooms for the night. Catherine found herself sharing quarters with Miss Porter, while Ross bunked with the other male passengers. "Your husband is quite the hero," Miss Porter commented as they prepared for bed. Catherine hesitated only briefly before agreeing. "Yes, he is." She had grown accustomed to the pretense, finding it easier than explaining their complicated arrangement. "And yet you seem troubled," the schoolteacher observed shrewdly. Catherine sighed, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed. "We're traveling to Virginia City to find my brother. He's been missing for months. I'm afraid of what we might discover." Miss Porter's expression softened. Family is worth any journey, however difficult. She paused, then added with a small smile, though I suspect you wouldn't mind the company of your Mr. Holloway on any journey, brother or no. Catherine felt her cheeks warm. Is it that obvious? Only to another woman, Miss Porter assured her. The way you look at each other speaks volumes. She turned down the lamp. Get some rest, Mrs. Holloway. Tomorrow brings another day of travel. In the quiet darkness, Catherine reflected on the schoolteacher's words, the way they looked at each other. Was it possible that Ross felt the same inexplicable pull that she did? The same growing affection that had taken root in her heart, despite the danger and uncertainty surrounding them. Morning brought clear skies, and the welcome news that the patrol would escort them the remainder of the way to Virginia City. The journey continued without further incident, though Ross remained vigilant, his hand never far from his weapon. As they descended the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, the landscape changed dramatically from dense forests to the more arid terrain of the Great Basin. The temperature rose as they dropped in elevation, and dust filled the coach despite the closed windows. Late on the afternoon of the third day, Virginia City appeared in the distance, a sprawling settlement clinging to the slopes of Mount Davidson, its buildings climbing the hillside in defiance of the rugged terrain. Even from a distance, the town's prosperity was evident in the solid structures and the constant movement of people and wagons. There it is, Ross said quietly, his shoulder pressed against Catherine's as they peered through the coach window. Virginia City. Catherine felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Somewhere in that bustling town, she might find answers about James, or she might find nothing at all. Either way, she knew this journey marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. Whatever happened in Virginia City would change the course of her life once more. The coach rattled down the main street, passing saloons and mercantiles, hotels and restaurants, all doing brisk business in the late afternoon sun. Mining operations were visible on the hillsides surrounding the town, wooden structures, marking the entrances to shafts that delved deep into the mountain in search of the famous Comstock silver. They bid farewell to their fellow passengers at the stage coach office, Miss Porter extracting a promise from Catherine to call upon her at the schoolhouse once they were settled. Ross secured rooms at a modest hotel, separate accommodations this time, as the danger of immediate pursuit seemed to have passed. "What now?" Catherine asked as they stood in the hotel lobby. "First, rest," Ross replied. "Tomorrow we start asking questions. I have contacts here, mining inspectors, other law officers. Someone will know about P. Montgomery and what happened to the contract laborers he purchased." In the privacy of her room, Catherine washed away the dust of travel and changed into her second dress, a deep blue cotton that Ross had chosen with surprising good taste. Standing at the window, she gazed out at the bustling town, wondering if James was somewhere below, perhaps looking up at the same evening sky. A knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Ross, similarly refreshed, his dark hair still damp from washing. "I thought you might be hungry," he said. "There's a decent restaurant across the street." Over a simple but satisfying meal, they discussed their plans for the following day. Ross would visit the local marshal's office and the mining inspector, while Catherine would inquire at boarding houses where contract laborers might have stayed. "We should be careful not to draw too much attention," Ross cautioned. "Blackwater's influence reaches here too, and after our escape, they'll be watching for us." "You think they knew we were coming to Virginia City specifically?" Catherine asked. Ross shook his head. "Not likely, but they know I'm investigating them and they know you're with me." That's enough reason for caution. As they finished their meal, A commotion outside drew their attention. A crowd had gathered around a man standing on a crate, his voice rising above the evening noise of the street. "The mining companies are bleeding us dry," the man shouted. "Working men 12 hours a day for starvation wages, while the owners grow fat on our sweat." Catherine and Ross moved closer, joining the crowd of onlookers. The speaker was a weathered man in his 30s, with the muscled build of a miner and the passionate delivery of a practiced orator. "And that's not the worst of it," he continued. "They're bringing in contract workers, men held in virtual slavery, forced to work off imaginary debts. How are honest laborers supposed to survive when competing with men who work for nothing but bare subsistence?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Catherine glanced at Ross, seeing his intense focus on the speaker. "The miners' union demands fair treatment for all workers," the man proclaimed. "An end to the contract system. 8 hours of honest work for 8 hours of honest pay." Cheers erupted from some in the crowd, while others muttered dissent. Mining town politics, Catherine was learning, were as complex as those in any eastern city. "Interesting," Ross murmured. "The union's been gaining strength here, might be useful for us." "How so?" Catherine asked. "Union men keep track of workers," Ross explained. "They know who's working where under what conditions. If your brother was brought here as a contract laborer, the union might have record of him, especially if he tried to join." A burly man in a deputy's badge approached the speaker, ordering him to disperse the gathering. The crowd began to break up, some heading to nearby saloons to continue the debate over drinks. "Let's follow him," Ross suggested, nodding toward the union speaker who was now stepping down from his crate. "Might save us some time tomorrow." They trailed the man to a modest building with "Virginia City Miners Union Hall" painted on its front window. Inside, a dozen or so men were gathered, some in work clothes direct from the mines, others cleaned up for the evening. Ross approached the speaker directly. "Excuse me, that was quite a speech out there." The man turned, wariness in his stance until he noted Ross's non-threatening demeanor. "Just speaking the truth. The companies don't like it much, but it needs saying." "I'm inclined to agree," Ross said, extending his hand. "Ross Holloway, this is Catherine Vance. We're looking for someone who might have come to Virginia City as a contract laborer last November." The union man shook Ross's hand cautiously. "Mike Sullivan, union secretary. Contract laborer, you say? Got a name?" "James Vance," Catherine said eagerly. "My brother. He was injured while working for Blackwater Mining in Grass Valley, then his debt contract was sold to someone named P. Montgomery here in Virginia City." Sullivan's expression darkened at the mention of Blackwater. "Those bastards. Been hearing about their operation for months." He gestured for them to follow him to a back office, where he consulted a thick ledger. "We try to keep track of all workers in the district, union or not. Helps us know who might need organizing." He ran his finger down pages of cramped handwriting, brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, he stopped, tapping the page. "Here. James Vance arrived November 1875, contracted to Preston Montgomery, Savage Mine." He looked up, his expression grave. "Paid off his contract in April of this year." Catherine's heart leapt. "He's free. Do you know where he is now?" Sullivan hesitated. "Last we heard, he was working independently, prospecting up in the hills north of town." He closed the ledger. "But that was 2 months ago. Prospectors move around, following rumors and hunches." "But he's alive," Catherine breathed, relief washing over her. "And he was here recently." "Do you have any idea where specifically he might be prospecting?" Ross asked. "Or who he might have been working with?" Sullivan thought for a moment. "There's a fellow named Dawson who was partnering with several independent miners, supplying equipment in exchange for a share of findings." He has an office on D Street. Might know more." Ross thanked Sullivan, pressing a donation into his hand for the union's efforts before they departed. As they walked back toward their hotel, Catherine could barely contain her excitement. "He's alive, Ross, and he was here just a few months ago." "It's promising," Ross agreed, his hand resting lightly on her back as they navigated the crowded sidewalk. "First thing tomorrow, we'll find this Dawson and see what he knows." Catherine impulsively caught his hand, squeezing it in gratitude. "Thank you for everything. I never would have gotten this far without you." Ross looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face, his expression softening in the glow of the street lamps. "I told you I'd help you find him. And you're a man of your word," Catherine finished with a smile. Back at the hotel, they paused outside Catherine's room. The halls were quiet, most guests either out enjoying Virginia City's nightlife or already retired. "Get some rest," Ross said. "Tomorrow could be a long day." Catherine nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from him. "Ross." "Yes." She hesitated, then impulsively rose on tiptoes to press a kiss to his cheek. "Good night." As she slipped into her room, Catherine caught a glimpse of Ross's startled expression giving way to something warmer, more intense. She closed the door, heart pounding, wondering if she'd been too forward and hoping that she hadn't imagined the look in his eyes that suggested he welcomed her gesture. Morning brought renewed purpose. After a quick breakfast, they set out for D Street to find Dawson's office. The mining supply dealer turned out to be a corpulent, jovial man with a shrewd business sense beneath his friendly exterior. "James Vance," he repeated after Ross's inquiry. "Sure, I outfitted him and a couple others back in May. Good worker, that one. Serious, though. Man on a mission, if you know what I mean." "Do you know where they were headed?" Catherine asked eagerly. Dawson scratched his beard. "They were working a claim about 15 miles northeast of here in the Virginia range, place called Eagle Canyon. Had some promising samples, too." His expression clouded. "Haven't heard from them in a while, though. Been meaning to send someone to check, but been too busy with the store." "We'd like to go there," Ross said. "Can you give us directions?" Dawson eyed them doubtfully. "It's rough country, especially for a lady." "No proper roads, just game trails and mining paths." "I can manage," Catherine insisted. "He's my brother." Impressed by her determination, Dawson sketched a rough map, marking landmarks and water sources. "You'll need supplies. Horses, too. I can arrange those for a reasonable fee." By noon, they were outfitted with sturdy mountain horses, provisions for several days, and detailed directions to Eagle Canyon. Ross had visited the marshal's office as well, sharing information about Blackwater's operations, and learning that Preston Montgomery, the man who had purchased James's contract, was a known associate of several mining companies with questionable labor practices. "The marshal says Montgomery left town suddenly about a month ago," Ross told Catherine as they prepared to depart. "Right around the time federal investigators started looking into contract labor abuses. You think that's related to James paying off his contract and going independent?" Catherine asked. Ross nodded grimly. "I'd bet on it. Your brother might have information Montgomery wouldn't want shared." This new concern added urgency to their journey. They set off shortly after midday, following the rough trail northeast out of Virginia City. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed into the Virginia range, with pine forests giving way to more barren landscapes dotted with sagebrush and juniper. By sunset, they had covered nearly 10 miles, making camp in a sheltered gully beside a small spring. Ross efficiently set up their simple camp, building a small fire for cooking while Catherine arranged their bedrolls. As darkness fell, bringing a chill to the mountain air, they sat close to the fire, sharing a meal of beans and bacon. The stars emerged brilliant and clear above, more numerous than Catherine had ever seen in the skies above Boston. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, gazing upward. "Harsh, but beautiful." Ross followed her gaze, nodding. "That's the West for you. Unforgiving, but with a beauty that gets under your skin until you can't imagine being anywhere else." Catherine studied his profile in the firelight, seeing the genuine affection in his expression as he looked at the rugged landscape around them. "Is that why you stayed? After the war?" He was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "Partly. Didn't have much to go back to in Pennsylvania and out here." He gestured to the open country. "Out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his family was or what side he fought for." "And becoming a marshal. Was that always your plan?" Ross shook his head. "No. Tried ranching for a while in Colorado, didn't take to it. Then prospecting in Nevada. Found just enough gold to keep me going, not enough to get rich." A smile touched his lips. "Then one day I helped track down a gang that had robbed the stage I was riding on. The marshal who deputized me for the job suggested I consider making it official." "It suits you," Catherine said. "Helping people, upholding the law." "Most days," Ross agreed. He glanced at her. "What about you? What was your life like before all this?" Catherine hugged her knees, considering. "Quiet. Proper. I lived with my aunt in Boston after our parents died, taught at a girls' school. Everyone expected I'd eventually marry a suitable gentleman, perhaps another teacher or a clerk." She smiled wryly. "No one expected I'd end up in the Sierra Nevada being auctioned off and then rescued by a marshal." "Do you regret it?" Ross asked. "Coming west?" "No," Catherine answered without hesitation. "Despite everything, no, in Boston I was. Existing. Following a path others had laid out. Here I've had to find my own way. It's been frightening, yes, but also—" She searched for the right word. "Liberating." Ross studied her face across the fire, his expression thoughtful. "You're a remarkable woman, Catherine Vance." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding. Catherine felt her heart beat faster, wondering if Ross would reach for her, if this moment under the vast western sky might be when everything between them changed. But a sudden noise from the darkness beyond their camp, the snap of a twig, the soft displacement of gravel, broke the moment. Ross was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself between Catherine and the direction of the sound. Silence answered him, then another faint noise like fabric brushing against brush. Ross stepped closer to Catherine, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Get behind that boulder. Now." She obeyed, crouching behind the large rock as Ross moved toward the darkness, his stance balanced and ready. The fire had burned low, leaving most of the camp in shadow, but in the faint light, Catherine saw a figure emerge from the darkness, a man, rifle raised. "That's far enough," the man called. "Drop the gun." Ross remained still. "I'm a U.S. Marshal, lower your weapon." A tense silence followed, neither man yielding. Then a second voice called from another direction. "Marshal, eh? What's a lawman doing out here?" Catherine peered around the boulder, trying to see the second speaker. Her movement caught the first man's attention, his rifle shifting slightly in her direction. "There's someone else," he warned. "Just my wife," Ross replied smoothly, not taking his eyes off the man. "We're looking for her brother, a miner named James Vance. You know him?" At the name, both men seemed to stiffen. "Vance," the second voice repeated, closer now. "James Vance." "Yes," Catherine called, standing despite Ross's warning gesture. "I'm his sister, Catherine." A long moment passed, then the first man slowly lowered his rifle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, stepping closer to the firelight. He was a weathered man in his 40s with a grizzled beard and the hard-muscled build of a career miner. His companion, now also emerging into the light, was younger, perhaps 30, with a healing cut across one cheek. "You're really Vance's sister?" the older man asked, eyeing Catherine skeptically. "I am," she affirmed. "I've come all the way from Boston to find him. Do you know where he is?" The two men exchanged glances. Finally, the older one spoke. "Name's Hardin. This here's Cooper. We were partnered with your brother on the Eagle Canyon claim." He hesitated. "Miss, maybe you better sit down." A cold dread settled in Catherine's stomach. "What's happened to him? Is he—" "He's alive," Cooper assured her quickly. "Least he was 2 weeks ago, but he's in trouble." Ross motioned the men to join them at the fire, holstering his weapon but remaining alert. "What kind of trouble?" Hardin sighed, settling cross-legged near the flames. "Started about a month back. We hit a good vein in our claim, not spectacular but steady. Enough to pay off our equipment and start seeing some profit. Then Montgomery showed up with some thugs," Cooper continued. "Claimed our claim overlapped with one of his, demanded a partnership. James wouldn't hear of it," Hardin added. "Said he'd paid off his debt fair and square, wasn't going to give Montgomery another cent. Things got heated." "There was a fight?" Ross asked. Cooper nodded, touching the healing cut on his face. "Montgomery's men jumped us one night, beat us pretty bad. They took James." Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Took him? Where?" "Montgomery has a private mining operation about 5 miles from our claim," Hardin explained. "Works men hard, keeps them isolated. We tried to get help from the county sheriff, but he's in Montgomery's pocket. Said James owed more on his contract and was being held legally." "There's nothing legal about it," Ross growled. "Contract labor has regulations. A man can't be held against his will once his debt is paid." "Try telling Montgomery that," Cooper said bitterly. "We've been watching the place, trying to figure out how to get James out. That's why we were skulking around your camp, thought you might be more of Montgomery's men." Catherine looked to Ross, determination hardening within her. "We have to help him." Ross nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "We will." He turned to the miners. "Can you take us to where they're holding him?" Hardin nodded. "First light. Place is guarded, but we know a back way in." As they settled in for the night, now with 2 additional companions sharing their camp, Catherine found it impossible to sleep. After tossing restlessly for an hour, she rose and moved to sit beside Ross, who had volunteered for first watch. "You should rest," he said softly as she settled beside him on a fallen log. "Tomorrow will be difficult." "I can't sleep," Catherine admitted. "Not knowing James is so close and in such trouble." Ross's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers curling around hers with gentle strength. "We'll get him out, I promise." Catherine looked up at him, studying his profile against the starlit sky. "Why are you doing all this, Ross? You've risked so much, your job, your life, for me and James. Men you barely know." Ross was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "When I saw you on that auction platform in Grass Valley, something changed for me. You stood there, terrified but refusing to break, and I knew I couldn't just ride away." He paused, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "I told myself it was just the job, stopping Blackwater, upholding the law. But the truth is, it was you, Catherine. Something about you pulled me in from that first moment when I told you to look at me, not them." Catherine's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "Ross, I know it's been a strange way to come to know each other," he continued, a hint of wry humor in his tone. "Being shot at, chased across state lines, pretending to be married. Not exactly a proper courtship." "I've never much cared for proper," Catherine replied, moving closer to him on the log until their shoulders touched. "If I had, I'd still be in Boston, teaching other people's children and wondering what happened to James." Ross's free hand came up to cup her cheek, turning her face toward his. In the silver moonlight, his eyes were dark and intent. "Catherine, when this is over, when we've found your brother and he's safe, I want—" "What do you want?" she whispered, her heart pounding. "A chance," he answered simply. "A chance to court you properly. To see if what I feel, what I think you might feel too, is something that could grow into something lasting." Catherine's answer wasn't in words. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened as Ross responded, his arms slipping around her waist to draw her closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Catherine smiled. "I think that's a yes." Ross's answering smile was brief but brilliant, lighting his normally serious features. "Good," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers, "because I don't think I could bear to lose you now." A discreet cough from the direction of the campfire reminded them they weren't alone. Cooper had risen for his watch shift and was studiously avoiding looking in their direction as he stirred the embers of the fire. Ross cleared his throat, standing and helping Catherine to her feet. "Try to get some rest," he said, his voice gruff but his touch gentle. "We have a rescue to plan in the morning." Dawn broke clear and cool over the Virginia range. After a hurried breakfast, the small party set off, Hardin leading the way with Cooper bringing up the rear. They traveled for nearly 3 hours, leaving the horses hidden in a sheltered ravine before proceeding on foot for the final approach. Montgomery's private mining operation came into view as they crested a rocky ridge, a collection of rough buildings nestled in a narrow valley, with the dark mouth of a mine shaft visible in the hillside behind. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, and Catherine could see figures moving between the building's workers. She presumed, though from this distance it was impossible to identify individuals. "There," Hardin whispered, pointing to a small, windowless structure set apart from the others. "That's where they keep men who cause trouble. James would be in there." Ross surveyed the camp with narrowed eyes. "How many guards?" "6 usually," Cooper replied. "Plus Montgomery, though he comes and goes, has a fancier place in Virginia City where he spends most nights." "Is he here now?" Catherine asked. Cooper shook his head. "Don't think so. His horse isn't at the hitching post." Ross continued his assessment, counting guards and noting their patterns of movement. "We need a distraction," he finally said. "Something to draw most of the guards away from that holding cell." Hardin nodded toward a shed near the mine entrance. "That's their powder magazine, if something were to happen there." "No," Ross said firmly. "Too dangerous, could cause a cave-in or worse." He thought for a moment, then turned to Cooper. "That ridge to the south, how far is it from the camp?" "Quarter mile, maybe less," Cooper replied. "Good line of sight to the main buildings." "Perfect," Ross said. "Here's the plan. Cooper, you take that ridge. At exactly noon, fire a few shots into the air, make it sound like an attack is coming from that direction. Most of the guards will respond to that threat. Meanwhile," he continued, turning to Hardin, "you'll create a second distraction at the opposite end of the camp. Nothing dangerous, just noise. Maybe start a small brush fire if you can do it safely." "Between the two," Ross explained, "we should draw enough attention that Catherine and I can approach the holding cell from this ridge. With luck, we'll have James out before they realize what's happening." "And if there's a guard still at the cell?" Catherine asked. Ross's expression was grim. "I'll handle it, but I'm hoping it won't come to that." They synchronized their timepieces and separated, each moving to their designated positions. Catherine stayed close to Ross as they made their way down the rocky slope, using scrub brush and boulders for cover as they approached the perimeter of the camp. As noon approached, Ross handed Catherine his spare revolver. "Just in case," he said. "Remember what I taught you. Aim for the center of the body, and don't hesitate." Catherine nodded, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use the weapon. Her hands were steady as she checked that it was loaded, just as Ross had shown her during their journey. At precisely noon, shots rang out from the southern ridge, followed immediately by shouts from the guards. As Ross had predicted, most of them ran toward the perceived threat. Moments later, a commotion erupted at the northern end of the camp, Hardin's distraction. "Now," Ross whispered, and they moved swiftly toward the isolated building Hardin had identified as the holding cell. A single guard remained at the door, looking nervously toward the commotion at both ends of the camp. Ross approached silently from behind, disarming the man and rendering him unconscious with practiced efficiency. Catherine winced at the sound of the guard's body hitting the ground but wasted no time following Ross to the door. It was locked with a heavy padlock, which Ross shot off with a single, carefully placed bullet. The sound was lost amid the continuing gunfire from Cooper's position. The door swung open to reveal a dim interior, stinking of unwashed bodies and human waste. 3 men were chained to rings in the wall, their faces gaunt and bodies showing signs of abuse. Catherine's eyes scanned them frantically, settling on the figure in the corner. "James," she cried, rushing forward. He looked up, confusion and disbelief warring on his haggard face. "Catherine," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "Is it really you?" "It's me," she assured him, kneeling beside him as Ross worked quickly to pick the lock on his chains. "We've come to take you home." James's eyes filled with tears as the manacles fell away from his wrists. "How did you find me? How are you even here?" "It's a long story," Catherine said, helping him to his feet. He was thinner than she remembered, his once sturdy frame now wiry and taut, but the determined set of his jaw was the same. "One I'll tell you once we're safe." Ross had freed the other 2 prisoners as well, miners who had also run afoul of Montgomery's operation. "Can you all walk?" he asked, receiving nods in response. "Good. Stay low and follow me. We're not out of danger yet." They emerged from the holding cell to find the camp still in confusion, guards shouting and running between the 2 diversions. Ross led them along a route that kept buildings between them and most of the guards, heading toward the ravine where Hardin had said there was a back trail out of the valley. They had nearly reached the edge of the camp when a shout went up behind them. "Prisoners escaping! West perimeter! Run!" Ross ordered, turning to provide covering fire as the others fled toward the ravine. Catherine ran alongside James, supporting her weakened brother as best she could. The other miners had pulled ahead, disappearing into the brush at the valley's edge. A bullet kicked up dirt at their feet, spurring them to greater speed. They reached the ravine just as Ross caught up with them, breathing hard but uninjured. "Keep moving," he urged. "They'll be right behind us." The narrow ravine provided some cover as they made their way uphill, eventually rejoining Hardin at a pre-arranged meeting point. Cooper arrived minutes later, grinning with satisfaction at the success of their plan. "Montgomery's men are scouring the South Ridge," he reported. "By the time they figure out it was a diversion, we'll be long gone." They continued at a grueling pace for nearly an hour, putting as much distance between themselves and Montgomery's camp as possible, before finally stopping to rest in a sheltered hollow beside a small stream. Only then did James turn to Catherine with 1,000 questions in his eyes. "You came all the way from Boston. How? Why?" He shook his head in wonder. "And who is he?" he added, nodding toward Ross, who was standing watch at the edge of their temporary camp. Catherine took her brother's hands in hers. "When your letters stopped, I was worried. No one seemed to know what had happened to you, so I came west to find out." She smiled wryly. "It didn't go quite as planned." In simple terms, she explained her arrival in Grass Valley, her own entrapment in Blackwater's debt scheme, and the auction where Ross had intervened. James's expression darkened with anger as she spoke, particularly at the mention of her being put up for auction. "I'll kill them," he muttered. "Every last one of those Blackwater bastards." "No need," Ross said, joining them. "Federal agents are already dismantling their operation in California. With your testimony about what happened here, we can do the same to Montgomery." He extended his hand to James. "Ross Holloway, U.S. Marshal." James shook his hand, eyeing him with a mixture of gratitude and brotherly assessment. "You saved my sister and me. Thank you doesn't seem adequate." Ross's gaze briefly met Catherine's. "Your sister saved herself for the most part. I just helped out where I could." "He's being modest," Catherine said softly. "He risked everything to help me find you." James looked between them, noticing the way they looked at each other. A slow smile spread across his face, the first Catherine had seen since their reunion. "I see," he said simply. They rested only briefly before continuing their journey, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Montgomery's operation before nightfall. By sunset, they had rejoined their horses and made camp in a well-hidden valley several miles from their previous location. Over a campfire meal of bacon and beans, James shared his own story, how he'd been injured in the mine collapse, how Blackwater had added exorbitant medical expenses to his already inflated debt, and how his contract had been sold to Montgomery when it became clear James was going to keep questioning the accounting. "Montgomery's operation is even worse," James explained, his voice tight with anger. "At least Blackwater maintained the pretense of fair treatment. Montgomery doesn't bother. Men who don't meet their quotas don't eat. Men who try to escape are beaten, sometimes killed. The local sheriff looks the other way because Montgomery pays him well." "Not anymore," Ross said grimly. "Once we get back to Virginia City, I'll wire for federal agents. With testimony from you and the other men we rescued, we can shut Montgomery down for good." "And then what?" James asked, looking at Catherine. "Back to Boston." Catherine hesitated, her eyes meeting Ross's across the fire. "I don't know. Boston doesn't feel like home anymore." James studied her thoughtfully. "No, I imagine it wouldn't, not after all this." He smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I wasn't planning to go back either. The West has its dangers, but also its opportunities. A person can make their own way here." The following morning, they set off for Virginia City, the expanded party moving slower to accommodate the weakened condition of the rescued miners. Ross rode ahead occasionally, scouting for any sign of pursuit, but it seemed Montgomery's men had lost their trail. They reached the outskirts of Virginia City 2 days later, where Cooper and Hardin took their leave, heading to the miners' union hall to report what had happened, and to help the other rescued miners find lodging and medical attention. Ross, Catherine, and James continued to the hotel where Catherine and Ross had stayed previously. After securing a room for James and seeing him settled, Ross departed for the marshal's office to send his telegrams and make his report. Catherine stayed with her brother, tending to his injuries and making sure he ate properly. As his strength returned, so did his spirits, and by the 3rd day he was insisting on getting out of bed and moving around the room. "You should have seen Catherine at that auction," James said to Ross during one of the marshal's visits. "She's got more courage than most men I know." Ross smiled, his gaze warm as it rested on Catherine. "I know. She was terrified but refused to show it. Even then, I think I was half in love with her." The casual admission made Catherine's heart skip. They had shared no further intimate moments since that kiss by the campfire, both focused on James's rescue and recovery. But the feeling between them had continued to grow, evident in small touches, in shared glances, in the way Ross always seemed to know when she needed support without her having to ask. By the end of the week, federal agents had arrived in Virginia City, taking statements from James and the other rescued miners. Preston Montgomery was arrested attempting to flee to San Francisco, and his mining operation was shut down pending investigation. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked Ross as they walked along Virginia City's C Street one evening, enjoying the cooler air after a warm day. James was at the hotel, meeting with a mining engineer about potentially reopening the Eagle Canyon claim properly. Ross looked thoughtful. "My superiors have offered me a permanent position here in Nevada territory. The federal courthouse in Carson City needs experienced marshals." "And will you take it?" Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the hope rising within her. Ross stopped walking, turning to face her. "That depends." "On what?" He took her hands in his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "On you, Catherine, on what you want." Catherine's breath caught. "What I want." "James tells me he's planning to stay in Virginia City, make a proper go of that claim with Cooper and Hardin," Ross said. "If you're planning to stay with him, then Carson City is close enough that we could. That we could what?" Catherine prompted gently when he faltered. Ross took a deep breath. "That I could court you properly like I promised, that we could see if what's between us might grow into something permanent." Catherine smiled, stepping closer to him. "I'd like that very much, Ross. More than I can say." His answering smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious features. "Then I'll accept the position." "On one condition," Catherine added. Ross raised an eyebrow, waiting. "That you kiss me right now in the middle of C Street, not caring who sees or what they think." Ross laughed, a sound of pure joy that Catherine had rarely heard from him. "That," he said, pulling her close, "is a condition I'm more than happy to meet." As his lips met hers, Catherine felt the last pieces of her old life falling away, replaced by the promise of something new, something wild and free and full of possibility, like the vast western landscape that had become her home. The trembling young woman on the auction platform in Grass Valley seemed a lifetime away now. In her place stood a woman who had faced danger, crossed mountain ranges, and found not only her brother but also a love she had never expected. When they finally parted, Ross kept his arms around her, as if unwilling to let her go. "I love you, Catherine Vance," he said simply. "Have since the moment you looked at me, not them." "And I love you, Ross Holloway," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "For seeing me, truly seeing me when no one else did." Over the next few months, life fell into a pattern that suited them all. James and his partners reopened the Eagle Canyon claim with proper backing from a reputable investor. Catherine found work teaching at the same school where Miss Porter was employed, discovering a talent for educating the rough and tumble children of miners and merchants. Ross divided his time between Carson City and Virginia City, establishing himself as a fair but uncompromising enforcer of federal law. The miles between them during the week made their weekends together all the sweeter, their courtship progressing with a blend of propriety and passion that suited Catherine perfectly. The following spring, almost a year to the day after that fateful auction in Grass Valley, Catherine stood in a small church in Virginia City, wearing a simple white dress as she pledged her life to Ross Holloway. James gave her away, beaming with pride, while Cooper and Hardin served as witnesses. Even Miss Porter was there, dabbing at her eyes despite her usual composure. Their life together wasn't always easy. The West remained a challenging place, with harsh winters and the occasional outlaw requiring Ross's attention. But it was a life they had chosen together, a partnership forged in extraordinary circumstances and strengthened by ordinary days. 5 years later, Catherine stood on the porch of their home on the outskirts of Carson City, watching Ross teaching their 3-year-old son, William, to ride his first pony. Their daughter, Elizabeth, not yet a year old, slept peacefully in her cradle nearby. As Ross lifted William down from the pony, the boy ran laughing toward the house, his father following at a more measured pace. Catherine's heart swelled with contentment at the sight of them, her family, her home, her life so different from anything she could have imagined when she'd first set out from Boston in search of her brother. "What are you thinking?" Ross asked as he joined her on the porch, slipping an arm around her waist. Catherine leaned into his embrace, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together after all this time. "I was thinking about that day in Grass Valley, how terrified I was on that auction platform." Ross's arm tightened protectively around her. "That seems a lifetime ago." "It was," Catherine agreed. "I was a different person then, or perhaps not different, but incomplete. I hadn't found my strength yet." Ross pressed a kiss to her temple. "You always had strength, Catherine. You just needed the chance to discover it." She turned in his embrace, raising a hand to trace the familiar lines of his face, older now, with strands of silver beginning to appear in his dark hair, but still the same Ross who had bid $500 for her freedom all those years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Getting involved in my troubles. It nearly got you killed more than once." Ross shook his head, his expression serious. "Not for a single moment. You and these children are the best thing that ever happened to me, Catherine Holloway. I thank God every day that I was in Grass Valley that afternoon." As William came running back to show them a flower he had picked, and Elizabeth stirred in her cradle with a soft coo, Catherine smiled at her husband. "So do I, Ross. So do I." The trembling woman at the auction was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her strength, her family, and a love that had begun with 5 simple words. "Look at me, not them."